Thank you so much for joining today's webinar, Lessons on How Culture and Values Drive Performance with the authors of Business the NHL Way. I'd like to start by thanking today's sponsor, Overdrive Professional. Overdrive is dedicated to creating a world enlightened by reading, by delivering the industry's largest catalog of ebooks, audiobooks, and other digital media to a global network of over 88,000 libraries and schools in 109 countries. I'm Jess Thompson, Content Manager for Learning and Development at ATD, and I will be your moderator for today. Before we get started, did you know that ATD is celebrating our 80th anniversary this year? We invite you to join us at ATD's Premier Learning and Development Conference in San Diego. Each year, thousands of L&D professionals come together to take advantage of the latest tools, technology, and resources, networking with peers and speakers, career development opportunities, and more. Register today to lock in the current rate, and we hope to see you in San Diego this weekend. I'm very pleased to introduce today's presenters. Lindsay Levinson is a team lead at Overdrive Professional. She works with academic, corporate, and special libraries, and prior to joining Overdrive, Lindsay worked in collection development and as a technical services manager in public libraries. Stephen Rosado is a senior manager at Overdrive Professional. Before joining Overdrive in 2016, he was the event director of Book Expo America and has worked extensively with senior government officials and published luminaries from all over the world while running BEA's Global Market Forum program. Norm O'Reilly is Dean of the Graduate School of Business at the University of Maine and has authored or co-authored numerous books, including Sports Business Management, Decision Making Around the Globe, and 20 Secrets to Success for NCAA Student Athletes Who Won't Go Pro. Rick Burton is a professor of sport management at Syracuse University and a co-author of numerous books, including Forever Orange, The Story of Syracuse University, 20 Secrets to Success for NCAA Student Athletes Who Won't Go Pro, and Sports Business Unplugged, Leadership Challenges from the World of Sports. We have an exciting presentation lined up for you today. Please be sure to chat your comments and questions throughout today's presentation. And now, without further ado, Lindsay, Stephen, Norm, and Rick.
Good morning or good, oh, there we go, start sharing my screen a little bit better. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're located. Again, I'm Stephen Rosado, and if you are here for afternoon yoga, you've clicked on the wrong Zoom link. We are here for lessons on how culture and values drive performance, and particularly excited, thanks to the University of Toronto Press, to have the authors of Business the NHL Way here to share some of their insights with us. And you've already met all of us. You get to meet us one more time. I'm going to talk a little, give us our quick agenda here. We're going to talk just very quickly about, what is organizational culture and particularly why it matters. And then we're going to hear much deeper from both Rick and Norm from their book, but giving us some examples very specifically around how culture impacts organizations. And then we're going to talk with Lindsay, who is also has her master's in library science, is a professional librarian, but how she works with companies and organizations to use a library effectively for establishing culture and some of the best practices they do and the things that she sees firsthand. Like the slow fade in here. So what is organizational culture? It really refers to the shared values, beliefs, and behaviors and practices that define people within a company and how they interact with each other, make decisions, and work towards common goals. Strong and positive corporate culture definitely have a significant impact on a company's performance in several ways. One being just employee engagement. A positive corporate culture can help foster a sense of purpose, belonging, and fulfillment among employees. It leads to higher engagement and motivational levels. It certainly engaged employees are more likely to be productive, innovative, and far more committed to achieving company goals. It certainly impacts decision making. Your corporate culture, what's prioritized, what is emphasized as far as being ethical, being transparent, being collaborative, having that sort of a culture that's very inviting and open and solicits a lot of different points of view and ideas. It's not really just focused on short-term goals or personal gain. innovation is a big part of what you get in culture in an organization, encouraging creativity and risk-taking and experimentation that really fosters an environment of innovation and idea generation, leading to new products, services, and certainly helps achieve company goals. And also, specifically reputation. I think a company's reputation, by and large, is the living proof of the values and the culture that a company maintains or an organization. I came across this. I thought this was a really great way of saying, like, the two things that culture impact, with assumptions and behavior, and then it really does get to results. I'm not going to read through the text, but I want to highlight a couple examples, like on the positive. I mean, if you look at Google, which is really renowned for its unique culture, which emphasizes innovation, collaboration, and creativity. It's a company that encourages employees to take risks and experiment in new ideas and work together in complex problems. Google actually gives people time off to work on anything they want, and that has led to some of their biggest breakthroughs. Southwest Airlines is another one renowned for its positive customer-centric culture, which is built on principles of fun, friendliness, and flexibility. The company that values its employees and empowers them to take ownership of their work and make decisions that benefit both the company and its customers. Patagonia is just another one. It's a clothing company that it's known for a strong emphasis on sustainability, ethical business practices, and a deep connection to nature. Patagonia's employees are encouraged to live their values both at work and in their personal lives. I think one of their most successful campaigns is they encourage people not to buy anything new just on sustainability, and they end up actually selling more, but and they end up donating a lot. We admire Overdrive's a B Corp. That is a very significant part of our culture, but we always identify with companies like Patagonia, which is also a B Corp company. And there's also, on the flip side, you take all the positives of corporate culture, but there is certainly poor corporate culture has creates a lot of bad outcomes. And you could look no further than something like Enron, the permissiveness that that culture that permeated and allowed such a massive failure of such a large organization. Uber is one that is actually, widely thought of as a great tech company, but they've had a lot of issues facing numerous controversies over its corporate culture, including allegations of sexual harassment, discrimination, and a hostile work environment. And the company's culture was characterized as a bro mentality, aggressive competition, and a lack of accountability for executives and employees. These issues have led to a lot of public backlash and legal battles and loss of trust amongst customers and investors. And also even Wells Fargo, if you go back a little bit, where they were, that culture allowed them to just run amok with open accounts and put goals, however they are achieved, ahead of the customer and the corporate good. So those are just some examples of why culture does matter, both good and bad, and some of the stuff we do. So I'm really excited to hear from Rick and Norm right now. So I'm going to turn things over to them, and I will be advancing their slides on their command.
Thank you. Sorry, thank you, Steve. That was great. And thanks everyone for having us. As you can see the slide there, Steve, we can see kind of the background of your desktop. I don't know if that's bothering you or not, but if you want to go to the next slide, please, that would be great. So what we're here to do today is talk to you a little bit about a book that I think, Rick, we could say we're extremely proud of. Rick and I have been writing together for a very long time. If you followed the sport business industry and you read the Sport Business Journal, which is kind of the leading trade publication in our field, we've written a couple hundred articles every month since a long time ago, since Facebook was born approximately. So we've been at it for a while, and people seem to like our stuff. And this is probably our one we're maybe the most proud of. During COVID, we decided, we've done textbooks before, and Rick's done some books in other areas, and I've just largely done textbooks. So let's try something a little bit different, a little bit Moneyball-like, if you know that movie or that book from baseball, and say, what can we learn from a league that we know an awful lot about, which is the National Hockey League. Rick and I have both studied and followed and worked with clubs and teams of former students all throughout the league for a long time. We both know the commissioner who gave us his photo, as you can see there on Steve's slide, that kind of helped us. So that's the background before we get into it. Rick, I don't know if you want to add anything to that backstory.
No, I think the only thing I would add, and I didn't put it in my bio, is that I used to be the commissioner of the Pro Basketball League down in Australia. And so this topic of culture that we're going to discuss today is something that anyone who's been in a leadership position, I think, has to be aware of how important culture is. And certainly for me, having been a league commissioner, you have to think about it not only with the league office, but then also the culture that exists with your teams. And I think the comparable analog for your companies, the industries that you work in, is maybe the culture inside the entire organization, and then the culture inside a department. And they can vary, and I think that's part of what we should talk about today.
Thank you, Rick. So if you flip to the next one, Steve, that'd be great. So this is what Steve gave you a wonderful introduction to culture, and Rick gave you some anecdotes, and we're going to draw on very specifically the culture from the National Hockey League. And you can see our two pictures there. The one above is just general industry. It's maybe a bad photo, but we wanted to just tell you, like, the culture, as Steve well articulated, is vital in any organization that has more than one person, right? If you're one person, you kind of determine the culture you want, but you go beyond that sole proprietorship, all of a sudden you have to deal with multiple people, right? As Steve articulated. So having multiple people interacting gets more and more challenging. The bigger you get, the more different occupations you have, the type you have. Now, when you flip to professional sport, and the NHL could be indicative of the MLS, Premier Leagues, et cetera, and we've looked at this a lot, culture is very interesting because you have this very different dynamic than you see in most industries. One exception might be the film industry, where the actual talent on the field or creating the product is the highest paid. That's very, very atypical for most industries, where you kind of work yourself up, you get away from the core product or service, and you make more money. It is the opposite. So the players really create the product. And if you look at the rev share agreements, they're taking anywhere from 45 to 70% of total league revenues in salary. So anytime we deal with these organizations, immediately off the top of their budget, they're paying these 20, if you take the NHL, 25 players, half of their total revenues. Imagine your industry, for an instance, if that was the case. Very, very, very challenging. So the budgets are very constrained. So that gives us these two dynamics within the culture. There's the on-ice performance culture, and you could have on-field for MLS or Premier League, whatever. You want to talk about NFL and American football, you have that side, but you have then the side that we work more closely with, which is the management side. And so you have to manage, market, finance, sponsorship, all these different pieces of that organization with a big gap and very limited interaction with those highly paid group. You have to support them and raise the money to pay them. Plus you have to grow your operation. So the big players, the Yankees, the Cowboys, et cetera, the Toronto Maple Leafs and the NHL do very, very well. But the other clubs, it's much more challenging. And so there's really that duality of culture that we're going to talk about, which is very, very specific to elite professional sport. Rick, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I would add to it that what we have in sport is a scoreboard. And so we're aware all the time that someone is being identified as a winner and someone as a loser. And at the end of the season, we usually have a championship of some kind of Super Bowl, a one-game winner take all, or in basketball and hockey, a 7-game series where you've got to win 4 of the 7. And ultimately, people in sports, professional and amateur, collegiate, they talk about winning cultures and losing cultures. And I think that's driven in part by the nature of these competitive games. I was on the phone this morning with an executive, the chief operating officer for one of the National Football League teams. And he said, everyone in our organization is committed to a culture of winning. And he then used as an example, he went all the way down to the janitor, that the janitor was part of whether or not the team saw itself as a winner, that everything being done was to facilitate either the health and well-being of all the people that worked in the building, but ultimately for the product that got put on the field. And I thought that was an interesting thing because we tend not to think about certain people in our organization as to whether or not they contribute to our culture or whether we even consider them part of our culture. And here in the professional sports world, and Norm and I will talk about it more over the next hour, we look for it in a lot of different places. And we have 4 teams now in the Stanley Cup playoffs. 2 very shortly will be in the Stanley Cup itself. And everyone will be talking about what a great team culture they have. On the other hand, the Toronto Maple Leafs have not been in the Stanley Cup since 1967, or at least they haven't won it since 1967. And they keep getting eliminated early in the playoffs or not making the playoffs at all. And people, the media, because it's covered very much in a public way, are saying, what's wrong with the Maple Leafs culture? And so I think these are things that we can draw from as we talk further today.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. And one anecdote that a lot of you, and I'm Canadian, Rick's got some Newfoundlander blood in him. So we've got, and as you may, if you follow the hockey, the Edmonton Oilers and Toronto Maple Leafs both got knocked out in the last few days, meaning it's now 31 years since a Canadian team has won. And one of the analysts on ESPN last night, which just hit me when Rick was speaking there, captured the reason those are both teams on paper that should be going much further than they are, so they don't have a team identity which stems from a team culture. And this was an analyst who really understands the sport, taking that view, because in both cases, you'd argue that they're beaten by teams that they way outclass on the talent side. So great point, Rick. We go to the next one, please, Steve. And we'll talk quickly about this, and I think Steve introduced this very, very well. But when you think about values, we like to drive that towards decisions, right? That businesses make, and all of you know this and are involved in this kind of world, whether it's from an HR perspective or an agency perspective or finance perspective. When the values of your organization or your individual or your group or your team often drive how you look at things overall. And so if your value is high performance above diversity, or flip that around, that changes how you make a certain decision regarding hiring, for instance. And so for organizations, it's very important. They spend a lot of resources really identifying and then hiring people and having partners that fit with that same value proposition. And we found the values of the league to be quite interesting. So, and as Steve articulated up front, values are a huge driver of culture, and an effective culture, what determines it. So we just wanted to bring that up before we get into our stories.
And I would add to that by saying that all of you have worked for at least one boss in your career who made it clear that they felt everyone was expendable, right? And periodically these leaders, these administrators get outed for just how bad they are at building any kind of cohesion or any kind of, what Norm just used the phrase, team identity. And in a lot of cases, the team identity is we throw everyone under the bus and everyone is expendable, and you should be thankful that you're working here. Ultimately, those kinds of values play themselves out in ways that I don't think serve the organization.
Particularly in the current environment, right? When people can move very easily. Very good point. All right, next one, please, Steve. And one more kind of intro question that we wanted to do. And this is important in our context. And so when you're thinking about your context, it may be a little bit different. One of the interesting things about sport is there's this duality of on field, or on ice in this case, and off field performance. And often they're not related. So we often call this the nirvana. So an organization that is successful on the field and off the field. Great example would be the New England Patriots in the NFL. They've won 6 Super Bowls. They usually make the playoffs. They've had great players, coaches for 2 decades, right? Even longer, you could argue. Wonderful franchise. And they're generating 8 figures of profit every year, year over year. Owners wealthy, happy. It's great. Very few, you'd be surprised, pro sport organizations actually fit in that place. And in the NHL, you could almost argue that there's none. And there's some that have flipped in and out. So we talked about the Toronto Maple Leafs and the New York Rangers would be great examples of organizations that are generating very positive financial returns in the NHL, but are not generating the on-ice returns that their fans would like, their owners would like, et cetera. So they're in this interesting group. And there's also some that perform very, very well, but that cost their owners a lot of money. I mean, Man City in the EPL is the classic example. And there's a number of where the owner is just willing to spend and write a check every year. You can make an argument the Pittsburgh Penguins in the NHL fit into that bracket, right? That the salary cap and floor kind of saves the NHL a little bit. And then there are teams that it's neither. The owner's writing a check every year and they're not performing or winning on the ice. So so you've got that duality, which in most organizations, you're very focused on profitability or revenue more than expenses or whatever it is. There's that really, which is often at odds, especially if you're in an open market environment like Major League Baseball, for instance, there. So we wanted to make sure we clarified that before we got started.
And I'll just build on that by saying that while some of you don't follow sports closely and would never imagine that your organization can be aligned in any way with professional sports, I think the questions that we're asking here about what is performance, they cross or they translate really well. You know what performance looks like in your organization, and you know when you're performing well, and you know when you're underperforming. Some of you are at companies that are judged by Wall Street, and so profitability is the yardstick that we want to talk about. But others of you may not be in companies like that, but we have to measure performance one way or the other, because at the end of the day, we'll get around to talking about sustainability and whether or not we are going forward or we're going backwards. It's very, very hard to stand still and go nowhere. And so I think performance is a fair question, even if you're not a big sports fan.
Thank you. So Steve, you can probably go to the next two quickly. So one for the book, we're just saying, here's some lessons. We're just plugging ourselves again. No, perfect. Go back to one. Sorry, go back one.
Sorry about that.
No problem. And so the book, we're drawing on this. So the number on the left, we want to be sure we said this up front. That's not because we can't count, because you're going to see it doesn't go in order, but that's the chapter number of the book. So that's where they come from, and give you an idea of how we looked at it. So we went back and looked at the book very closely, and under Steve's theme for today around values and culture, drew out some of the pieces we thought were really apt to what we're discussing today. And clearly culture is something that's driven by leadership. And one of the things that really got us when we talked up front about when we decided to try this book and write in and get into it, and writing books for those that have done it is not easy, takes a lot of time, and is something you invest a lot in and may or may not get you anywhere at the end of the day. So you take a lot of risk. And so when we go into this, we're thinking very, very interesting. The story is this. So Gary Bettman, who's the commissioner of the NHL and has been now for 31 years, the longest standing ever. And some of the fans aren't big supporters of his. Some of the owners love him, but he's been very, very successful from an off the ice perspective. So we have this chart early in the book that shows the revenue of the league during his tenure, and any shareholder, any owner would be ecstatic with that kind of returns and growth on their investment over that period of time. You can argue other pieces about the leadership, but from a business lens, that's undebatable, right? It's been very, very successful as a league. And so this is the commissioner sets a huge tenure in sport. So they are responsible to all of the owners of the club, same in any professional sport, not unlike for those of you that are not-for-profit organizations, how the executive director or the CEO of the not-for-profit would be responsible, report to a board. Instead of a board, it's a board of governors who's made up of an owner or an owner's rep from each of the 32 clubs in the league. And so, Rick, maybe you want to say a little bit about Bettman and his influence on league culture.
Well, the thought that comes to mind, Norm, is the fact that there are fans every time the commissioner comes out to award the Stanley Cup that boo the commissioner because of the actions they've seen him take. And they believe when you go back and look at a lockout where the NHL didn't play any of its games, or the way in which the league negotiated with the players for the latest collective bargaining agreement, there are people dislike what the commissioner represents, but they forget in almost every case that the commissioner represents the wishes of the board of governors or of the owners. And in this way, Gary Bettman has been extremely successful at representing what his owners, the people that dictate where the business is going to go, goes. And he's got a number of employees who have stayed with him for 20, 25 years that are there, every day, because I think they believe very much in the culture he established internally. But externally, he's willing to wear the heat, meaning the criticisms that come from the media and from fans on behalf of the owners. And the owners don't actually then have to go out and be in public saying anything about the players or about lockouts or distasteful topics. They allow Gary Bettman to take all the arrows and slings that come from being out in front.
It's a great point, and that's what we talk about, leadership from the top. And there's other analogies in sport, other commissioners. Richard Pound, we both know well, led the World Anti-Doping Agency and some of its initial battles against athletes like Lance Armstrong, and he took the front. So you think about what that means externally, but as Rick said, how do you feel culturally when you know your leader is willing to do that for you? So we really tell that story, and we're going to tell a little bit about the growth of the league in a second in chapter 5. So clearly the leader is very, very important to installing those values and that culture that Steve kicked us off with.
Norm,
Steve,
let me
jump to-
just
go ahead.
let me just interject here that many of you, if you're in HR, may not be able to influence the behavior of the individual at the top. And in a lot of cases, the individual at the top is not maybe a positive person or is not aware of culture. And so it may fall to you to be able to explain, if you have the courage, that you have been studying the culture and you want to make sure that the CEO is aware of what people say or how people relate to the person at the top. Because we can have CEOs that are out of touch. We can have CEOs that are abrasive, and it will work in certain situations, but the rank and file will take cues from what works at the top. And we don't have to go far to find examples of organizations where, I don't want to call it the corruption at the top, but the disdain at the top for ethics, for fair play. We can find a lot of different ways to talk about how people at the top influence people at the bottom. And I think that you may not be able to change the person at the top, but it may fall to you to help them understand exactly how they're being perceived.
Thank you, Rick. Great build. So we'll go to the next one, please, Steve. So chapter 3, there's 2 slides on this one. I promise it's the only one we have 2 slides. We're going to do mostly talking. So this is a chapter where we dug into Bettman, but then other leaders in the world of sport and the world of ice hockey, and how we can draw from some of those things, help all of us. And so there's a whole, this is kind of a summary of the first part. There's 2 kind of figures at the end of that particular chapter. So this is things that we think, and this is very relevant for all of you, is that you can draw from what we've learned, much like the Moneyball idea, from the business of sport and ice hockey to any organization. And so these are 8 kind of drivers overall, some of which relate very much to revenue, some which kind of fit on culture. So we're gonna kind of cherry pick on a few of those as we kind of think about it. And so the first one, I'm going to pick the second one on the bottom row, which is you don't live in a fishbowl. And then Rick will grab one and we'll go back and forth a couple here. And so what are the things that you have an advantage of not being in professional sport is this notion of a fishbowl. And a lot have written about it and we've talked about it a lot. This is the idea that you're so much pressure on the culture of a professional sports team on the staff side, high performance side, that they make irrational decisions. And for those that know the Toronto Maple Leafs, we can say the New York Knicks, you could recently say Manchester United, these major clubs, sometimes you go, whoa, really? Like they make these player decisions that just seem nonsensical. And there's a lack of, like, it doesn't make sense from the player's age, doesn't make sense from the salary commitments and the financial commitments, doesn't make sense of what they gave up for the future. But it's this notion of a fishbowl. And it's one of the reasons why a lot of analysis shows this, but a lot also believe that a lot of the high value pressure packed market teams and the elite teams have trouble winning because their high performance managers can't be patient enough for a team culture, a team identity to develop, because they lose, and you see this, and the coach is fired, the general manager is fired, a player wants to leave, etc. I mean, Boston's making a run this year, the Celtics, and one of their players has already expressed the desire to leave the team. How's that indicative of a good culture? And how's that going to mean when they get into the final rounds and very pressure-filled games? So this notion of a fishbowl is something you don't have to worry about. So you can make much more long-term, thought out strategic decisions is one important one that we picked out that we can learn from, and learn not to fall into a fishbowl mentality when you worry too much about external things. I'll throw it to you, Rick.
Yeah, and I'll take the very last bottom row. This is like Hollywood squares. I'll take make your key staff stars. Most of you will know that research shows over and over again that the number one thing that employees want is to feel appreciated. They want to feel in on things. They want pats on the back. And this line, make your key staff stars, I think is about being able to recognize when people do good work and how we take the time to either reward them or acknowledge them. In the sports world, it's pretty easy because players are playing for contracts, they get media visibility, they get sponsorship deals. The biggest stars are known far and wide. Inside your organization, it's much harder to identify this person as a star beyond saying this person is marked for promotion. We think this person has a lot of potential. We're going to keep an eye on them. I think what we miss sometimes is this ability to actually make them feel like we appreciate their work and that we are watching them and think they do have potential, because most of you deal with retention as an issue, particularly with the generation that we are now leading or managing, which is I don't expect to stay at your company more than 2 years because I don't think you're going to make me a senior vice president in my first 6 weeks on the job. And so after those first 6 weeks, when you don't promote me, I'm going to be thinking about leaving you. And I think retention has become a huge issue for HR. And some of it is because our employees don't feel like they're making a difference. And all of us, I think, are probably going to have to work harder at that.
Thank you, Rick. I'm going to jump on the top row. We will do 2 more here, and then we'll move on to the next one. The top row, the third one, which is value creation for stakeholders that matter the most. And so, as we've kind of illustrated so far, there's a couple of very key groups that are most important when you think about the culture of a professional sport league, and then these are adaptable, obviously, to your own context. And the players we've talked about is clearly one, owners is clearly one. But one that we really dig into here is the notion of the fan. And so the fan is like your customer. So in your organizations, think about your customer. We call them fans, but essentially they're customer, and the club is extracting resources from them in turn for the value they provide. So really thinking about value creation in professional sport, in particular, the NHL was very slow to get to this style. And you can see that in their sponsorship revenues, which really didn't get going till like 2014. You can see it in their ticketing strategies, which were very, very simple until about 2005. And you can see it in their growth of other assets. And that's kind of the key one we want to talk about here, was the outdoor games. And so for many years, it was very, very focused on the 41, previously 40 home games in your own arena, generate those money, ticket sales, stay with the team. Well, in the 04-05 lockout, which we're talking about in a little bit, that Rick mentioned, things really kind of shifted. And so the league all of a sudden had the ability to generate revenues that would then be shared across the league. And the first thing they really did, in addition to television and streaming and stuff, was to create these heritage outdoor games. And they've become a brilliant success story for the league. And why are they successful? Well, it's something that their fans really want. The players, some of them like the novelty of it, but it's not a great surface to play on. It's an uncertain, it's like playing basketball versus indoors versus outdoors. All of a sudden you bring in the elements, could be too hot, could be too cold, could be windy, could be raining, could be snowing, could be damp, could be hard to see. Maybe you're not going to get as much performance in that game, but the fans love it. They harken back to outdoors ice skating nostalgia, and they're filling Fenway Park, filling the big house in Michigan. The 106,000 people watched a hockey game. There's amazing success stories around these assets that embraced the culture of the league and their primary stakeholder, in this case being the fans.
Yeah, I'm not going to add anything to that other than to suggest we go to the next slide, and we'll keep
right.
this moving so that I think we're out on time.
All right, good. So these are the 2 longest ones. We only have a couple of more, I think, after this. But for so this is a continuation of that chapter, really what we can learn from. And I'm going to take the second one on the first line here. And this is this idea that innovation should be prioritized over history. So what does that mean? Well, and a lot of organizations struggle with this. And it's really the notion of change. organizational change, culture change. Very, very challenging. And we know that there's a ton written on it. You all know a new boss comes in and wants to change things. There's initially resistance, there's fear, there's skepticism. We've always done it this way. Well, a lot of those places have kind of disappeared. And sport is one of the slowest to adapt. Look at the trials and tribulations of baseball trying to make their games shorter. They've finally made a few steps this year, but it's taken forever. And they lost a lot of younger fans. Now they're trying to bring them back, making the game more exciting. It's very challenging. So hockey was very challenging in this regard, but then was one that really kind of moved. And there's some examples like the glowing puck, which we talk about throughout the book, where it's like the traditionalists really, really disliked it. There's the notion of removing fighting, which they haven't done finally, but reducing fighting in the game. It's really gone down. In the playoffs, you don't see any fights at all. No one wants to be out for 5 minutes or take an instigator penalty. So they've really reduced it, even though some of the diehard traditional fans loved it. But that's opened up a much broader fan base that's interested in hockey and a family experience versus a couple of guys beating the crap out of each other, so to speak. So they've really, really focused on growth and innovation, changing that culture versus getting stuck in history, which hurts a lot of sport organizations. Right.
I'll go to embrace strategic agility. I think companies these days have got to be more nimble than ever before. And I think that ultimately we have to be flexible at a time when technology is overtaking many people. It's kind of funny that I talk to students who have grown up with an iPhone, but the iPhone has only been around since 2008. Apple, within the next 18 months, will probably bring out either a product called Apple Glass or a ski mask kind of virtual reality device that is going to start to revolutionize some of how we think about technology. Now, Norm and I tend to think about it specifically for how that will influence the sport product, but all of you and your businesses know that the rate of change because of technology is faster than ever. Some of that is driven by Moore's Law. Gordon Moore, the great, scientist from Intel, he just passed away recently, but he predicted or theorized that the capability of the computer chip, the microchip, would double every 2 years. And since the 1960s, he's essentially been proven right. There have been a few minor aberrations in his law, but if you talk about the doubling of computer capacity every 2 years, then we're not surprised that we should be talking now about 6G, which is not that far off, artificial intelligence changing things, virtual reality and augmented reality. These are elements that, while they may not fit specifically into your department, undoubtedly are part of your company's or your organizational nimble effort. And I wanted to say nimblicity, but that doesn't exist as a word. So
Well, it could maybe your next book. That's a good.
Yeah,
title.
it could. Yeah. Nimblicity. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Rick, I think you got a nice call out in the chat. I'll acknowledge Ruby, who made supported strongly your comments on make your key staff stars, and to give her some credibility. I think it's a she, maybe Ruby, but the used to work for the Tampa Bay Lightning. So there you go. Well
Beautiful.
done. So Steve, you want to jump to the next one? So the next one is chapter 5, and this is one that, and we've kind of hinted at this, but this is a really interesting thing, and I think anyone can relate to this. And we're often afraid of our competitors or afraid of the big dogs in our field, but the NHL is a great example of an organization that's really looked at those that are successful. So as we mentioned up front, a lot of pro sport clubs around the world, leagues have failed many, many times. Owners have traditionally written big checks. A lot of owners have told us many times, you don't own a pro sport team to make any money. We would do something else if we wanted to make money. But they went and said, what is the NFL doing? What's the NBA doing? And Commissioner Bettman had come from the NBA, as a lot of you know, before he joined the NHL. And they did a couple of things. They looked at those models and went from basically a Major League Baseball EPL model of open market and went to this closed market, salary cap, salary floor, limiting free agency, forcing teams to move around, and then having this rev share, which we mentioned before, where things are now shared. So money, if the league generates money, it's shared 1/32 now. It used to be 1/30, but 1/32 clubs. So if they generate profit from a big media deal, so their new television deals in Canada and the US, from their streaming services, from NHL store, from the outdoor games, from sponsorship, that gets shared down. All of a sudden, the league has some influence, and away it goes. And the profitability and the value of the clubs has skyrocketed. As you know, the four bids that just came in for the Ottawa Senators, which closed yesterday, included a bid over $1 billion. $1 billion for an NHL club in a city of just over 1 million people, Ottawa, Ontario. Amazing, right? So you've seen this incredible return from that kind of approach. So don't be afraid to have a look around and maybe copy some of the things that they're doing.
Well, and I think we can also insert the word transferability. So it may be
Yeah.
that there is a big dog in your particular sector, but it doesn't mean that you can't take an idea from somewhere else. I think what happens a lot of times is we become fairly closed-minded. I worked inside a big corporation, and we really only did things one way, and that was the way we had always done them. And it was very hard for us to borrow from ideas that were around us. And it was one of the reasons I think we stayed in second place instead of making the run that we could have at the market share leader. So I think this ability to look at success elsewhere and then translate it back to your organization is worth commenting on.
Thank you. All right, the next one, please, Steve. So number 7, and we've kind of gotten into this a little bit in the chapter 3 piece. So we talked about the glowing puck, we talked about the outdoor game. So we'll do the other 2. So I know, Rick, which one would you like to do of the other 2? And I can do the
Well,
other one.
I like 3-on-3 overtime because it's just an exciting product. And many of you may be familiar with the growth strategies chart, which is how organizations think about growing their business. And one is further market penetration, which usually costs a lot of money and you don't get very far because you're already in a saturated marketplace. One is to introduce new products, one is to go into new markets, and one is to diversify. And I think 3-on-3 overtime is a form of a new product inside the existing product. And I think that it works because the ice is much more spread out. It's much more likely to lead to scoring faster. And it works, I think, at a lot of different levels. But think always, my counsel would be, think always about what you're doing to grow your organization and your organization's either bottom line or the measurements by which you're held accountable.
Very, very good. And the backstory of the overtime was, you may remember the tie. So this was a really awful outcome for fans. And so that shift was really, really good. The Department of Player Safety, very similar to what Rick's just explained, an innovation of changing the game, and back to being willing to do this is easier said than done in pro sport. A lot of resistance to change. And so this was around player kind of misbehavior. And so what the league did, and others have copied it, is they took a famous retired player, just to retire, Brendan Shanahan, and gave him this title. And he's since moved on and been an executive and been replaced. And so it had this Department of Player Safety. So whenever a controversial call came on, or a decision about a suspension had to be made because a player did something really bad, he would come on, not a league press release. He would come on video on NBC at the time, or when it was launched, or CBC in Canada. Those have now changed to Rogers and TNT and ESPN, et cetera. But those on those networks, and he would explain with video his decision. And it was really, really powerful to turn a negative, like Rick just explained with the tie going to overtime, into an exciting, fan-driven, culture-changing kind of innovation. And so there's lots of those examples, and we're really happy with that. Steve, the next one, please. Try to keep moving here. Rick, I don't know if you want to take this one. This is kind of an area.
Yeah, no, I think that we put a lot of effort into talking about diversity, inclusion, equity, and we wrote actually adaptability, and talked about sledge hockey. And we think that all of you are empowered to push a diversity discussion or a DEIA discussion, and it's just, so incredibly valuable to every organization. I don't think that's a liberal statement. I don't think it's a political statement. And while the NHL is really only a male-focused sport, I think that what we can look at is that they had an opportunity to be the first league to break the gender barrier, and they came very close with a female goaltender. And ultimately, I think one of the pro sports leagues is going to break the gender barrier.
Yeah, Man and Rayon, we write about, who played some exhibition games for the Tampa Bay Lightning we talked about earlier. There we go. Abigail just would beat me to the punch with the name. So we write a lot about Mano in the book. The next one along this, if you go to the next one, Steve, it'd be great. So we mentioned this earlier, fighting. And so this is a really interesting one. And Rick's got a joke he'll probably tell in a second. But when you think about conflict in sport, I mean, hockey is one. Like you think of some other sports, it's quite a violent, aggressive game. And fighting, basically a boxing match on skates, has been part of the game for a long time. Now it's been on the decline, and there's been a lot of pressure from various fan groups to keep or remove fighting from a game. And we write this really nice, we think, introduction to the chapter where you think about a couple of different contexts. So, you know, Rick and I and a couple of buddies head over to the game for a bachelor party or something. Wow, we'd love to see a couple of guys drop their gloves and go. But then, you know, Rick is going with his two daughters who are 8 and 11 and trying to showcase them the game. And look, there's two guys now beating each other up. Or your son who's 11, who you're trying to show good stuff to, is like, well, no, if someone sticks you in the back, you don't turn around and punch them in the face, kind of thing. Or so there's these, so that's the notion. This is the challenge, is we know there's a history of the game. We know there's a real part of the fans and culture that love that. Yet on the other side, there's a large group of fans and a potentially larger, more lucrative fan base that doesn't want to see that in a game. And so you get all of those kind of pieces at play. And the NHL, we think, has made a very positive approach to it. They've not eliminated it. They've gradually reduced it. So it's now become only when it kind of matters and impacts the game. There used to be, speaking of culture, every team had a goon. So some guy would be on the bench who might have been an okay hockey player, but wouldn't have made the team otherwise. It was an awfully good boxer, fighter, fisticuffer, and would get tapped on the shoulder once in a while to say, hey, it's time to get out there. So-and-so is bothering our star. Well, because of all these changes, that player no longer has a spot in the league. And those that fight are also good players. It's part of the game. It's more selective. It's been really, really, we think, a pretty positive approach that's helped capture that larger fan base, but didn't kind of lose that hardcore piece. And Rick, I know you have a few comments on extending this to the organizations.
I think that what's important to recognize is that all of you, if you're in HR, are dealing with conflict in the workplace or conflict in society. And Norm and I chose the fighting chapter as a means of talking about how do we resolve conflict in the workplace. Obviously, this is a veiled, shout out for you to buy our book, and we apologize for the gratuitous nature of that. But I think that when we look at people who disagree with one another, people who can't sit near one another, people who are disruptive in our workplace, we actually have to confront these things. And while many of you would be against fighting in sport, particularly maybe in hockey, you recognize that this a lot of times changes everybody's perception of where things stand because it has been dealt with. And I think because these days so many young people don't like conflict, they don't like conflict resolution, they don't like conflict management, we actually have disruptive personalities in the workforce and no one is dealing with them. Now, obviously, we don't want fisticuffs in the cubicles, but someone actually needs to be aware of conflict on the floor and whether or not it's actually being dealt with.
Thank you, Rick. Steve, I'll go to the next one. We have 3 to go, so we'll try to move through these relatively quickly. So veterans matter. And this is a chapter where we really dug into, and this is relatively new in sport, but it's been around for a while. I mean, you go Gordie Howe for the hockey fans who played into his 50s. But it's a really illustrative chapter about the idea that a veteran matters. So often, and I think HR can relate to this very clearly, and a lot is written on this, we're focused on the new shiny toy, fresh graduates, new talent that come in, when the people we may have who've been here for a long time, who maybe don't have exactly the cutting edge skill, or in the hockey context are declining slightly their skating speed, their shot speed, their recovery time, et cetera, as they get older. but they have so many more intangibles to add. And we tell the Zdeno Chara story, former captain of the Boston Bruins. In fact, just ran the Boston Marathon. He's almost 50 now, and he's 6'8" and quite a story. So we tell the story of him and a number of others that you shouldn't underestimate the value and the importance of a veteran staff person to your organization, and versus, you know, kind of the new shiny talent. So, and we talked about the fishbowl earlier. A lot of those clubs, this churn of players has hurt their performance. Others sticking with them has done very well. Rick, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think that we reference in the book the Robert De Niro movie, The Intern, and the fact that there is wisdom out there that can be savored. A lot of our organizations are letting all of its institutional knowledge or institutional history go out the door. And we talk in the book about another book written by a woman named Joan Ryan, who did a book called Intangibles. And the book is really about team chemistry. And in the book, she really writes about the kind of different profiles that different people bring to a locker room. It's in our book, but it's in your organization. And some people are the enforcers, some people are the sage, some people are the rookie, some people are the jester. And I think that what you want to understand is that there are people in your organization that we have tended to write off. Too old, too slow. They don't produce like they used to. They seem to be out of here on, you know, Fridays at 4:30. They take every, you know, holiday and put a vacation day with it. So they have a 4-day vacation. They bother us in different ways. And yet they may play a part in your locker room that you've been overlooking.
Thank you, Rick. Great point. Next one, please, Steve. So second last one. So Don Cherry, for anyone that knows hockey, particularly in Canada, you'll recognize him. And this is a great story about how things around us change and how culture changes within an organization without. And here's a guy that was an icon, who eventually got fired for the commentary that made him so popular earlier in his career as the world kind of shifted. So he was an average, below average, we'll say, minor league hockey player, became an exceptional coach, and then became a world-renowned commentator, a color commentator in ice hockey in Canada. He was so popular. So in Canada, is a bilingual country, English and French. In the French broadcast of Hockey Night in Canada, he would speak in the intermissions. French-speaking Canadians would flip over to the English-speaking coverage by the thousands to listen to him and then flip back. He was very controversial, very stoic, very strong, very, very conservative values, believed in the sport and kids, the military, very positive for North Americans versus Europeans. So he'd make some comments that way. So controversial, but funny. Some people liked him, some people disliked him. He bothered a lot of people around the edges, but very, very popular. Made $1 million a year at one point in his career, which was a lot for a commentator in Canada, and then was eventually fired just early in the COVID period for some insensitive commentary around Aboriginal Canadians. And so this was a really interesting story, and we didn't want to say love him, like him, etc., but we wanted to say this is how the culture of the world can change. And someone who at one point, 1990s, was the pinnacle of what a commentator could be, and without much shifting in his commentary, but the world changing around him, eventually lost his job for that particular type of commentary. One of the things we write about in that chapter was his power in terms of sponsorship. So he was literally on for maybe 90 seconds in each intermission, very, very quick, maybe 2.5 minutes, highly watched, the most watched part of the programming at the time. He had sponsors, so a large, men's clothing company was doing his attire. He was quite a flamboyant dresser, as you can see in the photo, and was really, really, really good. So we wanted to talk about him. I know, Rick, we're going to wrap, but you want to say something quickly about Willie O'Ree, number 13, and then we'll be done, Steve. So
no, I'm going to pass. I know
Okay.
that Steve and the team need to cover some materials, but thank you to everybody for letting us talk a little bit about the book and things we think could potentially benefit your organization. So, Steve, we're going to turn it back over to you.
Thanks so much. You guys were great. That was good. I had a ton of questions. I just want to go pretty quickly. We're going to talk with Lindsay, who works with all of our corporate accounts in the U.S. and one of the reasons why this is such a great venue for us is because we're primarily dealing with HR folks. So the ATD members are definitely in our sweet spot. So I wanted to ask Lindsay just a few questions on what she deals with on a day-to-day basis, particularly most of the organizations that come to Overdrive, whether it's a for-profit or a nonprofit or association, they do look to use an Overdrive library to support culture as well as professional development. One of the things I wanted to ask you, Lindsay, I mean, you do work with a huge variety, everything from multinationals like Microsoft to companies with as few as 50 or even 100 people. Is there anything that's fairly universal that you see?
Oops, I was on mute there. As you said, each account is unique and each of them have kind of different industry specific content needs, but almost all of them try to support titles on leadership, change management, and company culture. That's a pretty common theme. And then some of the other ones that are coming up, of course, DEI, hot topic right now, communication. I'm also seeing some companies shift to having more of like an employee benefit. So wellness programs, self-improvement. They even are doing book clubs for employee resource groups. Some are even actually buying fiction titles as just kind of an added employee perk.
Lindsay, I was going to show just a couple of the collections from some actual customers and highlight some of the things that they promote while asking the question. So I'll move around a little bit and show some of these things, but they're using books and audiobooks. Are there any things that are more, I mean, you touched on it a little bit just now, but more particular that are suited to books and things that are more challenging to sort of promote using books?
Yeah, I think it really kind of depends upon the organization. An interesting example would be the hospitals that we work with, particularly Mayo Clinic. It's a very large organization and they have different medical libraries in different locations. And with the digital library, they've seen really great success. They're able to offer, you know, a wider variety of healthcare, health and fitness, medical related topics to patients and staff, and they're able to reach more users with more content.
And just, I know for HR, I mean, we're almost at time here, but one of the holy grails is, you know, being able to measure the effect of this, whether it's a learning management system or rolling out programs like this, it is bringing that engagement. Is there anything in particular, any success stories that you could share where you've seen like really good outcomes from programs that have been rolled out? And even I'll continue to sort of poke around at some of these collections that I have up, but talk about how other companies model, you know, get that engagement across it. Sorry, that was a multi-part question for you.
Yeah, we have a lot of unique organizations. A lot of them are sticking to that leadership and development types of titles. But what I think one of the most interesting types of organizations we work with are correctional facilities. The physical books are becoming less and less in correctional facilities and they're turning to digital. And I think it's something really unique that we offer. We offer kind of enrichment, educational titles, pleasure reading materials. We have a correctional facility that has an educational program specifically that helps inmates who are reading and involved in this program to have their good behavior and to potentially get out earlier.
I want to leave time for at least one or two questions. I do want to say Overdrive will be in San Diego at ATD, so you can find us there if you want to ask any questions. And I was highlighting just some of the things you could just see how specific values are reinforced by specific collections of books. And they also allow staff to be able to put, you know, pick those books to be part of the collection. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jess to see if any questions came in for, I know Rick and Norm had a lot of really great content in there, but at least give us a minute to one or two questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, everyone, for this fantastic presentation. While we're waiting for one or two questions to come in, how can participants keep up with all the great things that you have going on? Maybe connect with you on LinkedIn if there are any outstanding questions from today's presentation.
I believe the deck's going to go out with us. And at the last slide, which I moved past, we do have our LinkedIn and all our handles, if you will, from Twitter and so on.
LinkedIn
Wonderful.
is perfect for me. Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen and Norm. Thank you. All right, just waiting for one question. Just to kick us off really quick, this question is for Rick and Norm. What are some of the key things you would advise companies in accessing their culture?
I think that's a great question. And I think it's, if people remember the book, The 1 Minute Manager, the walking around and being in the culture, I think it's a huge part of getting out of one's office and finding out how things are. I worked for a boss, never left his office, never seemed to care about the employees, probably wouldn't have known what they were talking about or complaining about. And all of us have stories similar to that. So that's my quick answer. Norm, you may have something to add.
I think there was a question in the chat, Jess. I think you may have seen that at mind if we take that one? I think just because
Yeah,
someone
go
asked
for
it,
it.
Nicholas asked.
Sure.
About the whole point about the figurehead of the organization kind of taking the bullets, as you said, Rick, that Commissioner Bettman did, and that the fact in the kind of the corporate world that could lead to a decrease in stock, and why is it different in the sport world? Why would the culture be such that it kind of works in the other way? And there's a couple of things that are really important here. One is that pro sport is really the best description of a pro sport organization like the NHL is a cartel. Now, we're not saying that in a negative way, but there's a group of owners that hire the commissioner to run their business, as Rick articulated very well before. And so protecting that is really good. And then remember, the affinity to the fan is rarely to the league, unlike a company you would see, but to the club. So in the mind of most fans, they don't think the Edmonton Oilers or the New York Rangers and the NHL are the same group, even though from a cartel perspective, they very much are. And so there's that dissociated brands, which kind of protects it a little bit. And then that overall. So he's doing exactly what his ownership wants. Roger Goodell does the same thing, protects the owner interest, protects the league's interest, takes the bullets, keep the clubs the sexy, appealing piece that the fans want. That's how I would answer that question. Ricky, I don't know if you have anything you want to add.
No, I was going to just pick up on the question in the chat about how HR can work with senior leaders. I think one of the issues that we're all facing, and it's always been around, is our own courage in speaking truth to power and being able to say to a leader, and it happens across gender and race and in every way that you can possibly think about bias and how power is managed and controlled, that a lot of times we're not comfortable saying what we know to be true. And I think maybe HR has a slight get out of jail card to be able to speak on behalf of the organization. So to that question that's in the chat, I think it's critical. HR is a hugely important part of every organization because they should know what's really going on.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Norm and Rick and Stephen and Lindsay, for your time today. And thank you to all of our participants for their wonderful questions and all of their engagement. There were a lot of really great comments in the chat for all of you today. Want to take this time to thank our sponsor, Overdrive, again. And thank you so much to everyone for being a part of today's webinar. Enjoy your day.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
That was great. Thank you.
And this concludes today's webinar. We thank you all for attending. The recording will be available at webcast.td.org. We will send all registrants an email with that link. Please visit our event calendar to sign up for future webinars at webcast.td.org/events. Goodbye.